there is this resource that I'm a huge fan of, and they keep themselves up to date the most and all possible. And if you're involved in licensing at all, the Office 365 stack, I would highly suggest you keep this favorited in your toolbox. This basically allows you to select the different licensing and basically drill down into the features that are included within it, as well as provide links to the actual descriptions of those services. So if, for example, you're not familiar with how app governance works within your environment, you can just click this and it will give you a link to explain what exactly that is. And again, obviously, if you don't, still not sure if you're actually using that, you're more than welcome to reach out to us and we'll let you know if you are or not. So this utility is really great at determining what is included in each of the core SKUs as it relates between business enterprise levels. So for example, we're going to do a relatively common one here of just a Microsoft E3 versus a business premium. Business premium being more scoped towards small businesses, having that maximum of 300 user counts that we'll go over a little bit later when we talk about mixing and matching. But this is a good little side-by-side comparison because they are relatively close, but with some features showing up in the business premium that would not show up in enterprise and vice versa. So you can kind of see here, this tooling allows you to very quickly kind of go through and see what differences would be involved in different licenses. Everything from how big of an Exchange mailbox they're allowed to if it comes with anti-spam, Defender for Office 365 Plan 1. So for example, business premium would, enterprise E3 would not. Versus enterprise getting some more enterprise level type applications like InfoPath that's relatively legacy and more likely not being used in a small business environment. So this utility is great for identification of those services. What also is extremely helpful as it relates to this is actually swap screens, apologies, I have that on the wrong one, is this overarching map that will illustrate kind of Microsoft's approach to these licensing. So bring that up. So in a simplistic kind of way to think of it, because Microsoft's nomenclature is rather confusing, they're broken down into two main core SKUs. Those are your Microsoft 365 and your Office 365. This would be outside of these small business SKUs, but I'm going to cover these first as it's the most confusing nomenclature between an Office 365 E3 and a Microsoft 365 E3. And they are very different SKUs, but not entirely. That's what we're going to be kind of going over. The Office 365 SKUs includes everything kind of listed here in this diagram on the red side. And so it's more or less just a core SKU. Now, in addition to that, you have additional SKUs such as Enterprise Mobility and Security, which is a standalone offering that includes things like Intune, Azure Active Directory P1, or as they now call it, Intra P1 for your conditional access, self-service password resets, etc. And there's also a bundle for Windows Enterprise E3, and that's where you get your automatic upgrades to Windows 10 Enterprise, as well as, let's see what else we got in here. Always On VPN, which is an enterprise only, Windows 10 Enterprise only allowed feature. And by combining those three E3s together, that's what forms the Microsoft 365 E3. So anytime you're looking at a SKU and it starts with Office 365, it's important to remember that that's generally going to be your core services, your email, my Office install, my OneDrive, my SharePoint access, my Teams. Those are more or less core services. If it says Microsoft 365, then you know that these EMS and the Windows pieces are also bolted onto it. So, and this applies across the board, regardless of if it's an E3 or an E5 or even an F3. And so I'm going to just show that kind of example here. We have an Office 365 E3 and then some Microsoft 365 frontline F3s and enterprise E3s. And as we kind of scroll down here, once we get to the enterprise mobility and security area, you can kind of see here how Office 365 does not contain any of it. So no Azure Active Directory P1, no Intune, nothing. Both the F3 and the E3 do contain it because, again, they are that Microsoft 365, not Office 365. So that's what I kind of want to make sure that everyone on this call is kind of aware of, because that's going to be somewhat important as you're kind of looking at your licensing and where you're wanting to go. Because if, for example, you're wanting to implement more and more the zero trust model, but you're currently on Office 365 E3s, then you really want to start looking at the Microsoft 365 stacks instead of the Office 365. Because many of those features are included in them. You can bolt on individual features into an Office 365. So for example, if you're going to run Intune, you could just go get the Intune SKU. However, I would highly suggest against that because the vast majority of the time, the bundles are more effective. It was the vast majority of the time. That Intune standalone license, for example, is an $8 SKU, and there's only about a $10 to $12 difference between the E3 and Office E3. So as you can kind of imagine, well, actually it's 16. But as you can kind of imagine, with just one or two extra services, you're already past that cost threshold. So now that you kind of have a rough idea of how to check what is inside of a license, as well as what, based on what you're wanting to implement in the future, what bundles you should be kind of looking at, let's go into how you actually determine if they're actually being used. So I'm going to use two examples for this, and I have a dev tenant up for this. But what we're going to be looking at is the usage reporting. So there's a couple little hidden areas within, I shouldn't say hidden, there's a couple areas within the Microsoft 365 administrative interface that will actually allow you to determine if your users are overly licensed. The problem really is going to be the amount of users you have and the amount of time you have to kind of do this, if not done pragmatically, but kind of get into that as well. So to start, one of the main driving costs between these SKU tiers would be like Office install. Office is a very large gap in terms of pricing between an E1, for example, and an E3, or even the standard or the basic versus the standard business. So let's assume that we need to actually see if our users are using their Office. Well, Microsoft actually gives you a way to determine if people are using their Office. They may not actually realize it's already here and available. Within your reports, you can actually go into your usage reports, and within the Microsoft 365 apps, you can actually see the activations and the usage analytics for everyone who has used Office. Now, I've left this off on purpose in case anyone on this call were to run into this. If you have your usernames here and they are hidden, there is a setting that you need to go turn off because they will obscure the usernames here. If for whatever reason that is the case, the way to turn that off is you go to your settings, and we'll go to our organization settings, and then we're going to go to reporting. And there will be a checkbox here that you want to uncheck. This is basically just saying that we're going to hide all the usernames in those usage reports. Microsoft does this, at least my assumption, that they're doing this by default because they don't want managerial staff or administrative staff to kind of dive in there and see like, okay, how many emails are they actually sending? Are they actually working? So I believe by default, they hide those usernames, but you just go in there and check mark that box and you have access to those usernames. Once that's done, we can then go into our usage reports. We can go into, for example, Microsoft 365 apps and actually see how many people have actually activated their Office. Now, honestly, this has been a dev tenant. These are fake users. This is hydrated data. No one's activated anything. But if I'm shelling out, $20, $15 per person per Office install, you might want to pay attention to that because you'd be surprised. And we're seeing, especially on the younger demographics of employees, more and more are shifting towards using Office on the web. And in most cases, they're still licensed for full Office install, not even using it. And so literally just burning money. Another good example of using these usage analytics is if, for example, you're using anything like Teams phones. Obviously, that is an additional licensing charge. You would want to know if they are actually using it. So you can, for example, go to Microsoft Teams apps and get the actual usage and the call logs from the Teams Admin Center and see if they're actually making those calls. And again, this is a dev tenant. We're not going to have any activity here. But you can kind of see how by using the usage analytics reports that you can determine if your user are actually using that license. Because some of these licenses are relatively expensive, especially if you're in the middle of Deming Copilot. That's a $360 license for the year per person. It's a very expensive license. You're going to want to make sure whoever you assign that to is actually using it. And if not, reassign to somebody else who will. All right. Next, we're going to actually cover just unused licenses. This is very simple, but you would be shocked at how many organizations don't pay attention to this within your environment. One area that's very simple to check in terms of license savings, especially before acquiring new licenses, is just, do you have any spares? Many organizations will have an obscene amount of licensing kind of laid over. Now, if you're in an enterprise agreement, this is a little bit different, but from a CSP or even a pay-as-you-go, like you're paying Microsoft directly, you can acquire more licensing whenever you want. And you can also increase the tiering of that license, but we'll kind of get into that. But you can acquire licensing whenever you want. So by having spares just kind of laying around, unless they are just, onesie twosies, you're pretty much just tossing money out. And we have seen many organizations that also have, a good 20, 50 licenses that are relatively expensive, just hanging out for months and months and months at a time. And there's almost no reason for that. All right. So let's go on to something fun. So besides identification of services, because we've kind of gone through how you identify services within the bundles that you may already have, and then identifying based on the usage analytics, are they actually using said services? The other way to do it, which we find quite a large, is defunct or inactive users. So in many organizations, once you pass a certain size, the employee offboarding process, the day-to-day administrative tasks that come with running an IT department and ensuring user objects and service accounts are all accounted for, there's always things falling between the cracks. We see this in every organization. It always ranges between 15 to 30%. That's not a joke. Every single one. I haven't found one yet. That's not the case. Where we're seeing accounts licensed and that are incurring a cost, but we're not actually seeing any usage on that. So there's actually a couple different ways you can approach this problem in terms of identifying dead accounts. And I'm going to be kind of walking you through a couple of those here. So the easiest way is going to be to actually check their last logon history as well as their non-interactive logon history. The easiest way to check that from a non-programmatic way is to go to Azure AD or Intra. And as you can kind of see here, we'll just go to Intra. It's already selecting on me, but that's where we're going to go here soon. So we're going to go to myself, and you will see on my user object in the bottom right corner that I have two values for sign-ins: last interactive, last non-interactive. Interactive sign-ins are any sign-ins to a 365 service or SAML application. That's super important too, because accessing a SAML application will get flagged in here. That's really important. Any interactive sign-in that you're actually pushing your username and password or doing an MFA prompt on counts as an interactive. Any non-interactive is where you already have a token for access and you're just refreshing that token. So for example, if I'm on an Azure AD join machine, I have a primary refresh token. When I go to access Outlook, I'm not actually authing again. I'm using that token to grant myself access to my Exchange mailbox. So that'd be a non-interactive login. There was no back and forth dialogue. That's actually very important because when looking at this on a person-by-person basis, this is simple enough that you can look at a single person. But when you start talking 100 people, 1,000 people, looking individually can be very difficult. And there is no actual report to currently pump out these two values for each person so that you can kind of check your own accounts. Now, our optimization engine will do that. We'll be happy to provide those reports for you. If, however, you do want to do it yourself, you pretty much have three ways to do it. You can do it through the IMSOL PowerShell module, although that is deprecated and is brutally slow now, and it will only give you the last interactive sign-ins. You can also use the Azure AD PowerShell, not as slow, but also only going to give you the last interactive sign-ins. The only programmatic way we've been able to find so far to get both these values is through the Graph API, and you'll need to create a service principal for that. We have scripts. I'm happy to send you, but it's relatively straightforward. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot them over. I'm happy to help you out. But by pulling that through all your users, you should be able to pretty much just walk through and see who hasn't actually used these services in, say, 30, 60, 90 days. And it should be relatively easy. Otherwise, unfortunately, you're going to be poking it through person by person as you're investigating someone. But if you have a small subsection of users, not too bad. So let's imagine, though, that we do find a user that has not signed in an extended period of time, but still maintains a license. Let's see real quick if I'm able to find a good example within ours, because I do believe I left one for this exact purpose. So let's say, for example, we have this user here, last interactive back in 2023, and our last non-interactive is still over 2 months. So let's just assume this was a completely dead user. Many organizations will leave the licensing in place as a mechanism to preserve the mail or the OneDrive data. And I'm actually here to tell you, you don't have to do that at all. So the suggested mechanism for termination of users is to convert their mailbox to shared. This eliminates the license requirement for it, and then to actually remove the licensing. Something that's very interesting that happens that many people don't realize within Microsoft 365 is that OneDrive data is never removed, even if you unlicense a user. So if you have a terminated user and they have email, they have OneDrive data, you're able to convert them to a shared mailbox so they can still receive that email, and then obviously have permissions to whoever may need it. But by pulling that license, you would think their OneDrive data and everything else would be gone, but it's not. It's actually maintained. It's actually maintained in such a way that admins can even go back in there after the fact and actually access that. Now, in order to facilitate that, it's a relatively straightforward approach. You pretty much go to your admin exchange center and you find the corresponding mailbox for that person, and you can convert it to shared, which will be one of the options up here. So, for example, if we were to, let's just say we're searching for this one. So it's currently a user mailbox. There's a button here to convert to shared mailbox. As soon as this is converted to a shared mailbox, he no longer has a license requirement for that mailbox. It will keep it alive as long as it needs to in perpetuity. Additionally, his OneDrive, once delicensed, would still remain there. The files remain there. They are accessible. It's just obviously he can't log in as himself, and you can't add additional files. So that kind of covers your dead users, stripping their licenses. It also covers your terminated staff members. If you're needing to maintain access to their mail, swap them to a shared mailbox. Don't worry about their OneDrive. You can always go back into it and access it from an administrative perspective. You can also relicense the user, and it will also allow access back into it from that account itself. And yeah, so that kind of goes over licensed. All right. Next, we're kind of going over monthly versus yearly. So with the new commerce experience, as it relates to these licenses, you actually have a choice when purchasing licensing between monthly and yearly. There is a 20% surcharge on monthlies, and it's kind of a brutal transition from what we were on from a CSP perspective, probably about a year and a half ago, prior to NCE, where the SKUs can be pretty much turned up and down as we saw fit. Now with NCE, you basically purchase it for a month or for a year, and you only have 7 days after that license is purchased to cancel it, or swap out for their SKU, which is just canceling and ordering a new one. Outside of that, the only modifications to a yearly NCE license is an inline upgrade. And what I mean by an inline upgrade is that it can only upgrade to something significantly high, or at a higher service level given that tier. So an E3 can move to an E5, for example, or an E1 to an E3, or an F3 to an E1, or from a standard to a premium. But you can't go from, for example, from a premium back down to a standard. So with that in mind, the whole monthly, yearly limitations, and the only the ability to cancel within 7 days or increase the tiering on the license, it kind of forces a start at the lowest acceptable licensing you can, and then pretty much add services as they need it. So for example, if you could get away with it within your environment, maybe don't start off every new employee with an Office install until they ask for it, because that will dramatically reduce your licensing tier for new staff members, as well as you save yourself cleanup down the road, because half of them aren't probably going to use it anyway, depending on your demographics for your staff. Also, when debating on monthly versus yearly, about the 8 or 9 month cutoff is when you should have probably gone yearly anyway. So if, for example, you need a license only for a temporary period, just know about 8 or 9 months is about that timeline where it's about the same if you go yearly or monthly. Mixing SKUs. So I wanted to also kind of go over mixing of small business and enterprise level SKUs, because many organizations don't realize they can do this. Some are totally hard coded onto just one type, but you don't need to do that. Certain SKUs, especially like the business premium one, for example, actually have an obscene amount of services within them for the dollar, because obviously they're kind of targeted towards small business SKUs, or towards small business organizations, apologies. The key here, though, is that those SKUs can only have up to 300 within the tenant. Now, that's not to say that you can only have 300 small business SKUs, and I need to hammer that point home. It's 300 on an individual level. So you could technically have 300 basic, 300 standard, and 300 premium, and 300 E3s or 400 E3s. Wouldn't matter. And that would be perfectly fine. You just can't have 301 premiums or 301 standards, etc. So why would you want to even really look at the small business SKUs? Well, it has about the same pricing as an Office 365 E3. Now, there are certain features in the E3 that may be related to your organization. So you'll want to double check that. For example, I believe DLP policies might be one. We'll actually go down this list and we'll find out. There may be, or InfoPath would be another good example as to why, if you were using that, you wouldn't want to move to a premium. As you can kind of see here, though, let's say you're using Anti-Spam with 365. The cheaper SKU actually contains services for that versus the E3 not. Now, granted, the E3 has a bigger OneDrive as well as a few other services, but you also don't have Intune. You don't have Azure DP1s. You don't have these other services, as well as your Windows Defender for Endpoint, for example. So you kind of see these two SKUs are relatively close pricing-wise, but feature-wise, they're completely different because they're targeting two different organizations. I'm trying to get across that you need to not listen to Microsoft when they tell you you're an enterprise, and pretty much sort out if you are based on the requirements of the licensing. Because if you're not doing any of these type of, well, see, even DLP's covered. So, man, so there's not really a lot of reasons. Sort of delve. Let's see here. No. Nope. So, yeah, that's a very good example of one where a small business SKU may be more effective in your organization. All right. So, that we've covered small business SKUs and how you can mix them. Let's talk about really weird ways you can also mix these. There are additional add-ons within 365 for these individual options. So, for example, if the business premium would have been a more appealing SKU based on your business requirements, but let's say the Exchange Online is the one part that isn't valid, you can easily take an Exchange Online P2 and actually bolt that on with it. Now, where this gets really, really interesting is that when you start looking at SKUs like an F3 that are generally for kind of frontline staff for dirt cheap kiosk 2 gig mailboxes, this immediately stands out as a very, very impactful wall, if you will, of mailbox size. Like office workers are going to hit a 2 gig mailbox within 6 months to a year pretty commonly. Frontline workers, not so much. But this F3 comes with a lot of stuff that you would actually be surprised comes in such a cheap SKU, such as your Intune, such as Azure DP1 or Intra P1, Azure Intune, such as Windows Server CAL rights, such as your always on VPN. And these are relatively expensive service offerings on a dirt cheap SKU, but you're kind of limited by that kiosk limitation here. So this is where this gets kind of interesting. You're able to take single sign-on or single add-ons, such as Exchange Online P1s, and combine them with an F3. And then this requirement now is moved up to 50 gigs. And so if none of the other ones are an issue and you're in compliance with the requirements of an F3 otherwise, and the only way you're violating it is that you have way too big of a mailbox, just slapping a $2 SKU or $4 SKU onto this, and you now are in alignment with them for half the cost. But now, granted, you're not going to have as big of a OneDrive, but you can do the same thing. You can throw a SharePoint plan on it if that's really that big of a deal. You still won't be anywhere near the pricing on the others. So you can get kind of creative with that, but again, just kind of focus on what your services your users are actually using, and identify accordingly. And if you need any help with that, just kind of reach out. We're happy to walk you through it. But this tool should help significantly with that. So what I'm going to do is, so this is our Azure instance. So as some of you may know, Azure is a much larger platform in terms of cost optimization, a whole lot of stuff you can kind of do in here. But so we're just been kind of covering the main points and where to kind of check if you do have an Azure instance, where to at least get the ball rolling. Because some of the stuff's kind of buried in here and they keep moving stuff around. So, it's just easy to give you where to go the easiest. Obviously, as you're kind of within your own Azure instance, we're going to be looking at this from like a subscription perspective. So we're going to go into subscriptions and we'll apply your skis one of my dev subscriptions just for testing. So we'll use this one. Now, let's see here. So you can kind of see this is one of my dev subscriptions. In terms of Azure cost reduction, there's one piece I want to just kind of point out to start with, and that is that Microsoft's actually made a good chunk of work in this regard for you. They just kind of bury it throughout their areas because it's actually under the subscriptions and under cost management and then under advisor recommendations. But the advisor recommendations are actually pretty halfway decent. Do I not have any on this one? There's no, I don't have any. Should pick different subscription. One sec. Maybe I have some on my second one. Okay, yeah, so I have one on this one. All right. So the advisor recommendations are going to cover certain things that are kind of low-hanging fruit. Okay, they're going to be your VMs on reserved instances because you're paying pay-as-you-go rates for these, and they've been on a long time. And if you're planning on keeping them, they should be reserved. For those unaware, reserving instances is basically where you're telling Microsoft that you are committing to taking up that VM and that compute resource for an extended period of time, and they basically cut you like 30 to 50% off your cost for that compute. Additionally, there's savings plans. Saving plans are a little bit more abstract to understand, but it's basically where it applies to all of your compute, and that would be like your app services, your VMs, even your Databricks and compute instances can count for it. But it basically sets a threshold so that if none of your compute pass that threshold, that is your flat cost, and you're just charged for any kind of overages of it. So especially if you have kind of spiky or sporadic kind of workloads, saving plans are great. Going back to this advisor data, the advisor data is going to show you stuff like right sizing, saving plans, your reserved instances that it would suggest. It's also going to show you any type of disks that are attached to things that shouldn't be. Now, it's only, again, going to kind of be low-hanging fruit, meaning it's going to have to be very obvious that they're way out of whack for them to kind of show up here, or that you just have disks that aren't even attached to a VM, in which case you're just paying for storage. It's not even doing anything. I want to iterate. Check this on every one of your subscriptions. You will be shocked the amount of savings you will find that you just had laying around because you didn't click a few buttons to click something under a reserved instance. Past that, there's much deeper areas you can kind of go as it relates to certain resources. So, for example, certain VMs, right sizing, certain applications. If, for example, this is one of the dev machines that I use for Graph API calls to determine if they're faster, if they're concurrent or not. If, for example, I'm in here and it's on and my monitoring and my CPU averaging is never passing 10% or 5%, and this is a production workload and it's relatively expensive in my cost management, then this is more than likely oversized. Now, granted, you need to actually pay close attention to your monitoring, obviously do at least like a 7-day lookup. But if your CPU usage, your memory usage, your storage isn't being taxed at all, and these are expensive resources, you can very easily turn those down and lower your costs across the board. With that in mind, though, right sizing needs to occur before any type of reserved instances. Because obviously you're reserving the instance, you're reserving that size. So you'd want to reduce your size and then reserve it, and you generally cut your costs by 70-80% for your VMs. Past that, many people don't realize that when you're running a VM within Azure, you're renting an operating system from Microsoft. This VM, for example, right now, although it has stopped, when it's running, I'm actually incurring a charge to rent this operating system from Microsoft. Now, if you already have a license, or if you have hybrid use rights, and if you're not familiar with hybrid use rights, the short of it is you have software assurance through your licensing agreement, or you have a subscription to an operating system through your CSP, then you have what's called hybrid use rights, and that license is valid to be ran in Azure or to be run on-prem. And if you're running it in Azure, you checkmark a box, and they basically won't bill you for renting that operating system. Where it gets even weirder is that renting the operating system is more expensive than the server operating system subscription. So if you are really trying to get every dollar you can out of Azure, and you know you're going to be using these servers for a while, right size them down to where they should be, reserve them, and then go get a license or subscription for that operating system license and turn off hybrid or turn on hybrid use rights. and then you're only paying for storage, and your costs dramatically go down. Other than that, the other one I'm going to kind of touch on, this will be the last one. We're going to go into these a lot deeper on the next call. Is going to be spot instances, and that is if you do have workloads within Azure that don't need to be up all the time, you can enable spot instances when creating them. You can also change existing VMs to spot instances, but I believe you actually have to do that through PowerShell command. Spot instances work by basically you're labeling yourself as not important. And anytime Azure needs additional resources in that region, it starts kicking the people out that are on spot instances, basically shutting off their equipment. So if you have asynchronous jobs running or things that take days and it just comes back up and picks up where it left off, depending on how you design your workloads, then spot instances are great because you can set them to pretty much automatically turn back on. And then if they get booted off because the capacity was needed in the region, they'll just kick back on and get back to work, and you slash your cost dramatically. And it helps Azure's side because they get to turn off people when they have high workloads. Obviously, from Microsoft's standpoint, what they're trying to avoid is the huge monster spikes that can happen with cloud technology, because all it takes is a single person that could spin up 50 VMs in 20 different regions and do that within 10 minutes. And so yeah, that pretty much kind of concludes the kind of cost reductions. To kind of go over what we went over the feature matrix, kind of going through how you're licensing, how you can identify what services you're actually using, how you can see what descriptions are of those services, what services are included in each of the licensing bundles. Additionally, we kind of went over how Microsoft's nomenclature is absolutely garbage and that they shouldn't call everything 365E something, but they do anyway. And so there's a very big difference between an Office 365 E3, which is really just core service SKUs, and a Microsoft 365 E3, which is that plus the EMS E3 plus the Windows E3. I also went over using usage analytics and using the usage reports to identify license savings opportunities. Basically, anybody who hasn't activated their Office probably doesn't need Office. Same with Teams Phone, same with any of these other services. We also went over unused licenses, how to check those in the admin center, how to actually see the last interactive logons and non-interactive logons of your users. So you can, if you are on the fence, if this account is dead or not, just go to Azure AD, go to the user object, check its last non-interactive logon, its last logon. If they're older than 30, 60, 90 days, whatever your company preference is, pull a screen test on them and delicensing. Because if they're not logging into a service, they're not using the service. This isn't difficult. All right. Let's see. We also went over downgrading over licensed users, especially as it related to shared mailboxes and that the OneDrive that nobody tells you about that's still there. Also, we had the question about the 100 gig mailbox, and just to iterate that, if it was 100 gig mailbox prior to conversion, it will remain that way, and it will not turn back, and use that for what you will. Monthly versus yearly limitations, monthly 20% surcharge. Yep, we went over all that, and mixing the SKUs and some Azure stuff. Put this demo together for you guys. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. If you need any help in identifying any of this, obviously reach out. We have an entire optimization engine that's built solely for this, and we're constantly expanding on it to try to make this as easy for you guys as possible. So anything else, just hit us up.